Well, good morning and welcome to this third CAFII webinar of 2023, with our focus in this session being on international regulatory trends and the work of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, or the IAIS. My name is Keith Martin, and I am the co-executive director of the Canadian Association of Financial Institutions and Insurance, or CAFII. On behalf of myself and my co-executive director colleague, Brendan Wicks, and the CAFII Board of Directors, thank you for joining our webinar today. CAFII is a not-for-profit association dedicated to the development of an open and flexible insurance marketplace. Our 15 members include the insurance arms of Canada's major banks and credit unions, along with their insurer partners, which underwrite credit protection insurance and travel insurance. This is another in our webinar series with key regulators, policymakers, and other experts and thought leaders in the insurance sector and on related societal issues. As I mentioned earlier, the topic that we will be discussing today is international regulatory trends and the work of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. We are very fortunate today to have Nicholas Herbert-Young with us. Nick is a member of the UK Financial Conduct Authority's International Department, where he has a focus on global institutions and where, as part of his FCA responsibilities, he is also Senior Relationship Manager to the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, the IAIS. In addition, Nick represents the FCA on the IAIS's Market Conduct Working Group, which FISRA CEO Mark White chairs, and he has also served recently on the IAIS's Virtual Small Group on COVID-19. Nick has represented the FCA and its predecessor regulator in the UK internationally for over 2 decades. He is qualified as a barrister and has lectured in law at a number of UK law schools. More recently, Nick has been a visiting lecturer at Henley Business School. If you have any questions during this session that you would like to pose to Nick during the Q&A session, please send them to me as the host using the Q&A function of Zoom, which is located at the bottom panel of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. Unless you specifically request in your question to be identified as its source, I will pose all questions to our panelists on an anonymous basis. And just before we get the webinar underway, I want to extend a special welcome to a number of VIP guest attendees. In addition to many representatives from our 15 CAFII member companies, we have attendees today from allied industry associations such as the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association, or CLHIA, the Travel Health Insurance Association, or THIA, and from insurance and financial services regulators and policymakers from across Canada, including the following: the Financial and Consumer Services Commission of New Brunswick, or FCNB, Quebec's Autorité des Marchés Financiers, or the AMF, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, or FISRA, the Insurance Councils of Saskatchewan, or ICS, the Alberta Insurance Council, or AIC, the Government of Alberta, the Alberta Treasury Board and Finance, or ATBF, the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority of Saskatchewan, also known as the FCAA, the Government of British Columbia, the Insurance Council of British Columbia, the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, or BCFSA, and the Government of Nova Scotia. So Nick, you certainly have a lot of your regulatory colleagues across Canada very interested in hearing from you today. Welcome to you all. Nick, let's get started. And I'd like to start by just asking you to tell us a bit about yourself and your role at the FCA in terms of global institutions, and in particular, your relationship and formal role with respect to the IAIS.
Well, thanks very much, Keith. Yes, at the Financial Conduct Authority, we're one of 2 regulators in the UK. The other is the Prudential Regulatory Authority. And our role is in relation primarily to conduct, whereas theirs is, as the name suggests, prudential. So what I do is work on the coordination of relationships that we have with IAIS. So I'm in charge of coordinating our input to them and making sure that we are represented where we need to be and where we can add value to what IAIS does. So in that respect, it's probably worth saying what IAIS actually does do. And in relation to consumers, it's there to ensure that supervision creates fair and safe circumstances for the protection of consumers. There's also a global financial stability aspect to its work as well. So there are two aspects to it. Mine is focused on the first, essentially, although obviously there's a financial stability issue that can face conduct regulators as well as prudential ones. So essentially my job is to identify where we can have some input given our objectives and our resources. So at the moment, as Keith mentioned, I was involved with the COVID-19 supervisory measures temporary working group, temporary committee. That was over a period of 2020 to 2021. But my main role is working on market conduct working group, and that's where I'm connected to Mark White of the FISRA and also to Julian Reid of the AMF, amongst others. So my job there is to represent FCA, of course, but also to put forward our thinking, to work with colleagues on the creation of issues papers or application papers where we identify issues of interest and concern within the ambit of what IS is under its 5-year plans, and to take forward that work as cooperatively as possible, drafting those papers where I can contribute in that way, or otherwise supporting that work. In my coordination role, we look at also fintech, operational resilience, and a number of other areas of interest, including governance, which is almost a sister committee, sister working group to the market conduct working group. So we're in at the working end of it, if you like, and with Mark in the chair, he succeeded one of my colleagues from FCA. So with Mark in the chair, he's progressing the work on diversity, equity, and inclusion at the moment.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, Nick. Just to delve a little bit more deeply into the IAIS, maybe you could tell us its membership, and as well a little bit about how it influences regulatory authorities across the world. I mean, it is not a regulator, and it doesn't have enforcement capabilities, but it does have influence and does produce papers that are a sort of consensus of the different regulatory authorities, and so they then can enforce it in their own jurisdictions, as I understand it. Is that a correct interpretation? And can you sort of elaborate on those elements?
Yeah, it's a good summary. What I would say is IS has over 200 members from over 200 jurisdictions, and I think it represents, in terms of its membership, 97% of the world's premiums. In that sense, it's very open. From the UK, you have two bodies. That's us and the Prudential Regulation Authority. It has a representation from a huge number of bodies across the various regions of the world, and it divides up the regions so that, for example, inputs can come from each regional area in terms of, say, consumer issues. When they're being discussed, we look to identify consumer bodies that are interested in making submissions to us and consulting with us. But so, for example, you have, in terms of authorities, you would have many of the US commissions, state commissions present. There's a substantial presence there. Also, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. From a European point of view, you would have all the regulatory authorities that have a role from each member state of the European Union, but you would also have the EIOPA, which is the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, represented. And I think the European Commission has a place also on the ISXGO. So it's a combination, if you like, of not only regulators and supervisors, but also the European bodies above them that effectively create regulations and oversee what is done by those authorities. Also, you have a range across the world. So you would have, we have Australian counterparts, New Zealand counterparts, Japan, so on and so forth, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So you have a number, you have a range across Africa as well, and we work closely with the South African authorities, for example, and Mauritius. So there's a vast area of interest and participation. In terms of what IAS does, I mentioned its mission, in effect, the two parts of that in relation to protection and sort of fair treatment of consumers, and also to policyholders, and also the global financial stability point. What happens essentially is that there are layers, if you like, of principles, standards, and guidance that are set out by IAS, and those are, as Keith was saying, agreed between the members through various processes, and from time to time amended. There's also a system of review, or systems of review, so that members can be reviewed and their implementation can be assessed in relation to those principles and standards and guidance. And in terms of enforcement, it's not an enforcement body. That's right, but there is an element of it's important that review exercises take place. And for example, you would find, say, 10 jurisdictions were recently assessed in relation to what's called the holistic framework in relation to internationally active insurance groups. UK was one of those, so that was mainly the job of the Prudential Regulatory Authority, but also the FCA was involved in that. Other jurisdictions included US, Germany, France, and Canada. So 10 altogether. So we're scrutinized by our peers. And in that sense, there's that. There's also a peer review process in relation to our application of insurance core principles. So the one of main concern to me is the Insurance Core Principle 19 on conduct of business, and the FCA was part of the membership or contributed to the assessment of ICP 19 back in 2021. And we were assessed with observed status, so we were scrutinized by our peers in relation to our implementation of all of that principle, which has a serious number of standards within it. I hope that gives you some color anyway.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Nick. And just a couple of supplemental questions. So it's nearly like the UN in the sense of such a broad membership. How do you achieve consensus? How do you move things forward with so many different organizations with different cultures, different perspectives, different priorities? And in relation to that as well, could you tell us if there's a staff secretariat to support and how large it is?
Yes, firstly, there's a staff secretariat. So it's very substantial. I think it has something like 30 to 35 members. I may be wrong about that, but that's my recollection. So, for example, on a market conduct working group, we have a colleague who in the secretariat, and she is also secretariat member for the governance working group. So where we overlap, which we do quite a lot from time to time, she sort of helps us work together to develop our thinking and so on. So we have a Secretary General who's currently Jonathan Dixon, formerly of the South African.
That's a paid position, Nick? That's not a voluntary position.
Yes.
It's a position.
That's a paid position, yes.
And these positions, sorry to interrupt, they're funded by the members, I presume?
Yes, so the funding is essentially membership based. There is other input in terms of funds, but largely it's membership based payments, and that's based on, I think, on premium income for the relevant state, so, or relevant jurisdiction. So that's certainly the case. What was the other part of the question, Keith? It was.
Well, I was saying it's a bit like the UN, so large. How do you achieve consensus? How do you move things forward?
But consensus is achieved in a number of ways. First of all, you have an agreed 5-year plan where there are particular objectives set out, and those are developed over time with the support of an annual roadmap. So you have stages of development there, and there's to some extent much depends on who's willing to put in the effort. but a lot of members are, and increasingly so, I think. I mean, it's become much more of a worldwide organization in terms of how people contribute, which is, I think, is a good thing. So it's not simply a question of the more developed countries playing a part. Other jurisdictions are coming in as well and playing an increasing role. So there's a lot of buy-in. I think obviously when you're drafting papers, whether they're simply discussing issues or in extensive application papers, looking at how members might think of applying particular principles and standards and so on. When you get that, there's some will be more equipped than others to do this because they might have more experience or they might have more interest and more willingness to put themselves forward to do this sort of work. So the working group will put that together, but we're looked over by senior committees. So for market conduct working group, for example, and governance working group, you're looking at the policy development committee, which has representation from across regions, so there's a good regional spread, and they review what we do, make their own comments, look at comments that are made by people who give feedback or bodies that give feedback, and ultimately decide whether we're going the right direction or not. And the chair or the vice chair of the relevant working group will have to explain what we're doing, and with support from the Secretariat. So it works like that, essentially. And ultimately, when sign-off is achieved, it's after a long process. There's consultation built into that, both within IAS and with the broader public. So it does mean that the effort effectively is rewarded in the publication of the relevant paper or material, supporting material for IAS. But you do get I think in my own experience, I think the input has diversified a lot since I started getting involved with this 5 years ago or so.
Excellent. That's good to hear. So, Nick, just on a couple of practical questions. I believe the head office of the IAIS, you've told me, is in Basel, Switzerland. But is that where the Secretariat is located? And are the meetings located there, or are they spread around or virtual? Could you just give us a little bit of that practical flavor?
Yeah, so IAS is based in Basel in Switzerland. Sometimes meetings are there held in person, but the IAS has an environmental policy which is introduced in the last few years to try and reduce the sort of carbon footprint. So you do have virtual meetings much more than before. I think from my own perspective, the COVID had a big impact in that direction, but I think that's where IAS wanted to go anyway, to reduce its carbon footprint. So you'll have virtual meetings, and you'll have occasionally you have a global seminar usually in the summer, and that may be in a specific location, which is not Basel, but will be hosted by a member authority and jurisdiction. And there's also the annual general meeting and conference in November. And that's usually hosted by another member. So there's a mixture of different locations, in spite of the fact that the main office is Basel. The office is Basel, but there's a good geographical spread of locations where one can go to for particular events. But there's also a control on how much environmental impact IAS has.
Understood. Okay, thank you for that, Nick. And I just want to remind attendees on this webinar that you can use the Q&A function of Zoom if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to pose them to Nick on your behalf. Nick, I want to talk about Canada a little bit. I think probably in most cases, the representative for insurance at IAIS is the state. In Canada, of course, insurance is provincially regulated. And so my understanding is the AMF has been a valued and important contributor for many, many years. And more recently, FSRA has joined. Are those the key Canadian representatives at a provincial level on the IAIS? And do you have any other Canadian sort of input?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience, really, which is which is in the context of market conduct, governance, and a few other areas. So I would say it's FISRA and the AMF who are my main counterparts and who have become significant contributors to the sort of work streams that I'm involved in. So I can't speak for other authorities in that respect, right, or in relation to other authorities. But it's certainly a valued contribution, and I think the experience of working with my counterparts has been a very good one.
Excellent, it's great to hear. So let's move, Nick, into the key regulatory trends for the IAIS and its priorities. You've touched on a few of them. Can you give us a little bit more detail on what the IAIS, in terms of your part? I know you're not representing the entire gamut of what the organization works on, but in terms of your focus, what are some of the things that you're really looking at right now?
Well, I think let me focus on market conduct for the most part, because that's my particular domain. The key work, I think, over the last 2 to 3 years has been on and related to insurer culture and also to DE&I. So in that respect, there are 2 big areas that have been focused on by IAIS. Now, IAIS identified these some time ago, and in terms of conduct and culture, the work we've done has been joint with the governance working group, and a product of it has been a paper, an issues paper, which discusses or picks out certain areas that members think are important, and shows, for example, issues that we think are significant in relation to the world as it is and as it should be, but also in terms of the insurance core principles, which are IS's bedrock, if you like. So ICP 19 on conduct of business, but other core principles as well that relate to the governance of firms and their practices and so forth. So that's been particularly important. So we've looked there at what culture is, or how we understand it, or how it's understood by different members of IAS, where we want to go with, where we're going with that in our jurisdictions, where we think some of the key issues are, and they tended to be more in relation to governance than in relation to firms' relationship with its consumers. But that's all wrapped together. So we tried to look at both prudential risks and conduct risks in that respect, because the governance working group and market conduct working group had particular focuses which had to be accommodated. But I think that paper is worth looking at, and it was published in December 2021. So that set the context, if you like, for culture, and I think that's been a constant of the last 4 to 5 years. It may be going forward because the strategic plan and financial outlook ends next year, so there'll be a new one being developed for the following 5 years. So that's been a key part of what we've been doing. Also, DE&I is more recent in the sense that it's been a more recent work stream, but there we are. We're not working directly together with governance, but we're looking at, and this is under Mark's chairmanship, the fair treatment of customers, particularly in relation to those with diversity or vulnerability issues, and their treatment by insurers and insurance brokers.
And do you do any work in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity on identifying whether the members of the IAIS are meeting the standards that you have set? Do you do any sort of like audits or work with them in terms of ensuring that they're meeting the highest levels?
Well, at the moment we're looking at building supervisory knowledge and understanding of where we are with DE&I. Some jurisdictions will have it more as a clearly more as something they expect of their regulators to do. Others may be less so. But I think what we're looking at is how we sharing experience of D&I in our respective jurisdictions, and thinking about how that might apply in relation to the firm-consumer relationship.
And this is a fairly new initiative, Nick?
Yes, this is fairly new. What I would recommend actually in terms of D&I and the work done is a stock take that we produced last year. I think it was December. So if you look on the IS website, there's a stock take of D&I work, which is relates to what members do in themselves, and we took a poll of IS members, and I think 39 responded altogether. So there'll be useful information for people to look at in terms of where we are at the moment with D&I, and also tested the water with some industry bodies as well. So do have a look at the stock take, and there's also a very good webinar session or stakeholder event from 9th of February, which Mark and his counterpart on the Governance Working Group, Anna Genova from the UK PRA, and Helen Rowell, who's on the D&I lead on the IS Exco, presented at. So that's from the 9th of February. That's also on the website of the IS public website. So that would give you an idea of where we are at the moment and how things are developing.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you, Nick. I want to turn to something from the industry perspective that is very important to CAFII, which is principles-based regulation.
Yes,
it's our view that, as opposed to prescriptive regulation, principles-based regulation is the best approach for regulators to take in terms of consumer protection and industry efficiency. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little detail on the IAIS position on this, and any work your colleagues and yourself have done on principles-based regulation.
Yeah, I think this is a personal view, obviously, but in terms of my experience of IAS, it looks to accommodate within its principles and standards and guides the approaches that its members take. It's a membership-based organization, so it does have its principles. I think they're altogether, there are 25 by number, maybe 24 in actual material substance. So you do have a principles-based approach in that sense, because the principles are there, but you have the standards underneath them, and guidance as well. So that's clear enough and clearly set out. But of course, these are agreed, and members obviously subscribe to them when they join, and continue to subscribe to them by their membership continuing. So in that sense, the basis is principles. But of course, members have their own jurisdictions, and so not all members are going to be principles based. They may have a variety of approaches, or they may look to more detailed and prescriptive rules. From the FCA's point of view, we set out principles for businesses, and those are the key to the way we proceed. And we've also established something called a consumer duty, which we've just introduced and takes effect from the end of July this year for all open business. And those are really very important for us. But also we have to, firms will want some steer on how those principles apply and what their content is and how they work. So we do have a pretty substantial handbook of rules and guidance. And so in terms of products, we set out what we expect firms to do and what we look for in the sort of inception and life cycle of products, for example. So on the one hand, you could say we're not a products regulator, but on the other hand, we have rules and guidance on what we expect to see in products, insurance products. So one has to put in that caveat. I mean, my own experience, for what it's worth, over decades, has been that sometimes you get a big ask for principles-based approaches, and then you have firms which also say, well, can you give us some clarity on this, or develop that, and so on and so forth, which is perfectly legitimate, I think. That can always help, and you want to know where you are. So yes, I mean, I think principles are very good. They need elaboration, and that's, I think, what the industry expects. So, but I can't comment on how other regulators and counterparts that I've got approach it, because that's different. But you find we have a common law jurisdiction, obviously, in the UK. So we have a way of thinking that might appeal to find principles very appealing. In sort of more civilist jurisdictions, they might want clearer rules or clear emphasis on rules, and understand regulation more in that sense. So we all have to work together to make something that is agreeable to all of us, or satisfactory enough to all of us in the end when we're working in IS.
Excellent. I just want to pivot to another issue, which is certainly in Canada, life insurance is not something most Canadians, I suspect most people, want to talk about. And there is a vast underinsured and uninsured group of Canadians, often more vulnerable Canadians or lower income Canadians. Have you done any work internationally in terms of that vulnerability, and what sort of efforts can be made to try to enhance the knowledge of people of the importance of life and health insurance in terms of protecting their families?
Well, there's some, in terms of IS, I think the work we're doing at the moment on, or we've just started on DE&I, and fair treatment goes to that. Obviously, you're looking at, when you're looking at diversity and inclusion, you're looking at the vulnerable, but you also might be looking at, so vulnerability in FCA terms is where you might have you have different types of vulnerability depending on your health, on your financial resilience, on your capability and capacity, and so on and so forth. So the vulnerability and diversity of consumers is very important in this, and how they're dealt with, and how I would try to achieve its objective of fair treatment within supervision. So in international terms, I would say that's an important consideration. And also looking at financial inclusion is something that's, and protection gaps has long been a concern of IIS, to try and work out, and a lot of its membership, to try and think about more about how these things can be dealt with and how they can be considered. So they are topics being considered at the moment, but of course they're in development to some extent, and so in terms of the roadmap and plan, at the moment the DE&I is the focus for it. But I think it's an encouraging step, I think, to see IS engaging in this and looking to across its membership, in a way, in the market conduct working group, to say, well, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the diversity issues and equity issues that we've got here, how do you include, and what amounts to fair treatment.
Excellent. I just want to reflect on a separate issue for a moment, Nick, and get your perspective. We're hopefully emerging from COVID, and we're seeing society sort of return to in-person events and to a more normal state. And yet there's some things that probably won't return to the way it was before. I mean, there's certainly a robust debate here in Canada about working at home versus working in the office, and I suspect that is happening in other jurisdictions as well. Certainly, when we reflect on COVID, it's very impressive how very large organizations like regulators, government, and industry, financial institutions, were able to pivot to supporting their customers digitally. And yet also, of course, there are lessons to be learned and things upon reflection that could have been done differently or better. And so I'd like to ask you about your experience in terms of the COVID mandate you had. with FCA and also with IAIS, and maybe would find it valuable just to hear your wise words about what your thoughts are on the past 3-4 years, and what you think are the lessons learned going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting and valuable question. I think in terms of our work at the FCA, I think we responded very quickly and very, very well to the challenge. As for many organizations, we had to adopt working from home very quickly. But I think though the adaptability of my colleagues was very good and very helpful, particularly in dealing with the and assisting IAS in its work, because there were reviews that have been scheduled, and we were able to respond to that across our organization, and I think many of our counterparts did that as well. So I think we showed the sort of necessary resilience pretty quickly. I think our concerns in relation to insurance were evidenced in some, obviously there were very, very good things going on, but the operational resilience was one of those issues that was critically important. At the same time, for different reasons, cyber risks were increased in profile. I mean, that's been a constant in regulatory minds and supervisor minds in recent years, and how that impacts on insurance, for example, as well. So I would say very clearly that from our point of view, we used the opportunity or the problems raised by COVID at the FCA to test our powers to go to court, to try and head off the expansion of issues to difficult proportions. So, for example, business interruption insurance, the whole process of going to court there to identify wording and settle issues by agreement with legal approval, a new departure for us. So I think that was something that I think attracted a lot of interest from our counterparts, both. So I talked to it in IIS, and there was interest there, and also particular interest from counterparts around the world who are looking at their powers to do the same thing. So I think that was something similar. So I think for me, one of the big lessons of COVID and takeaways for regulators was, how do you head off, and how can you head off or deal with issues that suddenly arise very quickly, and deal with them as effectively as possible, taking a lead with buy-in from the industry and policyholders.
Do you think society is better prepared for a future pandemic or a future unexpected event of such significant dimensions?
I have to say, I don't know. I certainly think as an organization, FCA is, and I'm sure colleagues at IAS will, even those who've come in sort of since COVID measures were relaxed or rescinded, I think IAS proved its capacity very well there as well.
Excellent. So, Nick, we were talking before the webinar started about how you're sort of an honorary Canadian. Your wife is Canadian. You visit Canada often, and you were recently here for several weeks in Toronto. And I mentioned this in particular because I believe you were here the week where the temperature was hitting 30 degrees plus in Toronto.
Yeah.
Much to your displeasure, I believe. But I raise this in terms of climate change, because people often around insurance rightly think about climate change in relation to, catastrophic floods, catastrophic fires. We certainly had no lack of exposure to that here in Canada, and British Columbia has been particularly hard hit in recent years, but no part of Canada has been spared. And so, that's usually what people think about, but we've had several webinars and sessions, Nick, on climate change as it relates to health and life insurance. And it does have a very important relationship. It does have a mortality and morbidity impact.
Yes.
Higher disease, higher death. I mean, when there's bad air that people are breathing due to fires, it causes all sort of respiratory issues. And so it's definitely of significance to life and health insurance. Is this something that the IAIS has touched on yet? And what sort of work are you potentially thinking of doing in this area? If you could just give us any thoughts on that, we'd appreciate it.
Well, there's certainly work going on in relation to climate risks, and there has been for several years, actually. There's IS works with a body called a UN body called the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which is made up of IS members, but others as well who have an interest. What that's done is essentially, in relation to climate risk, had a prudential focus on insurers' prudential capacity, if you like, to deal with that. So what's happening now is a consideration of conduct issues and other issues in relation to climate risks, and what we have to think about there. That's kind of work in progress, so I can't particularly comment on that. But IS is certainly very seized of the climate issues that exist, and is now moving on, if you like, from purely, well, a fairly pure prudential view of it to other aspects as well. So I can only go so far in talking about that, and that's probably as far as I can go. But there is work in progress, I think, on a number of non-prudential climate risk issues, which is probably worth looking out for as we proceed. So it's not. IS is perfectly aware of the broad range of issues. So in addressing them in conduct level, we're now looking at that.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Nick, I'd like to turn to fintech, artificial intelligence. I believe I heard you say that you've worked on the fintech issues, so I'd like to hear sort of work that you've done on that. I must say I was recently at a talk at CAFII by a technology expert who mentioned that ChatGPT has had the highest, fastest adoption ever of any technology. Over 100 million users, I think, in the course of just a few months have signed up. So I produce with my colleague Brendan Wicks a regulatory update every month. We just sort of provide some insights. In the latest one, I went to ChatGPT and asked it a bunch of questions about insurance, and its answers were pretty good. I mean, I might not know that it was a computer versus Brendan or myself that answered those questions. So it really is a significant development. I'm wondering, just more broadly in terms of some of these technology issues and fintech, the sort of work that the IS has done, and sort of your own personal thoughts on how this might impact on insurance and insurance regulation.
Yeah, I think IS has established a fintech forum, and one of my colleagues works on that, and she's been we've been long-standing members of that forum since its inception, as have a number of authorities, making it work and starting to think about issues and where they might be going and what issues might be coming, what are we developing out of them from our perspective. I mean, I would think in terms of my own experience with IS, that there's some useful papers from the 2018-2019 on digitalization and what the issues posed by that, particularly in terms of, say, you might look at how our sort of concerns have been how behaviors are dealt with and kind of learned effectively, which might not be good for the consumer. So it always sounds, sorry, it sounds rather negative, but it's inevitably in the sense of regulation and supervision, you're looking at what is protection to a large degree. So I would suggest, recommend some of the papers that IS produced in the 2018-2019 time, which look at digitalization and its impacts, or potential impacts and sort of concerns that we would have in relation to consumers. Certainly for the FCA, the whole business of artificial intelligence and digitization and data is huge. I'm not a particular specialist in that, so I can't make sort of interesting comments and disclosures about it. But certainly, I would point people to our website to see what we're doing there, because a lot of emphasis now, I think it's not just us, is on particularly on data and how we deal with that and how it informs what we do. And I would certainly sort of commend that kind of work to colleagues who are interested in it. So do look at our website on that. But I think in terms of FinTech Forum, there are publications IS has produced in relation to their work, I think. I'm pretty sure of that. So do look at the website for that. I mean, one has to so considerations of open insurance, for example, come to mind. And in the future, I'm sure there'll be other considerations on AI and so on and so forth.
That's helpful. We are hoping to post this a recording of this webinar, Nick, on our website, and perhaps after the webinar, I'll follow up with you and see if there's some colleagues of yours on the IS that I can get the links to these publications from, and then we'll post those on the same section of the website where this recording is, so that people will have easy access to it. It sounds like some really excellent resources are available. So, Nick, can you tell us a little bit about something else that I believe you've worked on, which is operational resilience? This is certainly something many provincial regulators have looked at. I know the Quebec AMF has paid some important attention and thought to operational resilience, and be very interested to hear what the international side has done in terms of that very important issue.
Yes, I have a colleague who is a member of the Operational Resilience Task Force, which IS runs, and has been worked closely with in that with counterparts. So we have a very FCA has a very sort of close working relationship with PRA on this. So our main concern on operational resilience is reflected in what happened during the COVID time era, essentially. Our concern is that firms are in a position to serve their customers properly, particularly those with vulnerabilities. One of the key points that arose actually prior to COVID was in terms of looking at the financial crisis. We had not only prudential issues to think about, but also the position of consumers, and particularly those who might be more vulnerable to how firms operate. So operational resilience, how that is arranged, how you deal with your, if you're a firm, how you deal with your consumers, how you deal with your third parties, and ensure that they are adequate and proper to do the work that you want of them, and so on and so forth. It's been a key consideration for us and our contribution to IIS.
Excellent. And is this something that has been sort of received by all the jurisdictions as an important component, or is this something you're sort of trying to impress upon jurisdiction as something that they need to think about?
Well, I think IS, in the IS context, and certainly in other jurisdictions, whether it's the regions of North America, South America, European Union, for example, and elsewhere, I think these are all common concerns. So I don't think I don't think FCA is particularly exceptional in taking a clear and close view on it and look at it. Certainly, IS has been heavily involved in this work or taken it on board for some years now. When it set up the task force as a dedicated team, I think that was 3 years ago, something like that. So this certainly reflects the COVID experience, and there's certainly a need for it.
I just want to remind attendees, we're coming close to the end of the webinar, and so if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. I'm going to ask you a very broad question next, Nick, which is, tell me the 3 big issues that keep you awake at night in terms of insurance regulation.
Well, in my world, I think it's the cost of living crisis. So how are potential consumers, not just the consumers or not just the customers, but the potential consumers treated and dealt with, and the underserved, if you like, because I think that particularly in countries where the state provides less than some would like, or the state provision isn't there, how do you deal with your responsibilities as a regulator, and what are they in relation to these types of communities of people? So that's one big thing. I think from my personal point of view, another one is this question of the climate risk and a sustainable environmental insurance, if you like, and what's necessary there. I mean, we talked about before we came on, I think we talked briefly about floods and other sort of natural or unnatural catastrophes that hit us these days. So I know that we've talked a lot to our counterparts about Flood Re, which is the British approach to dealing with people in areas that are prone to flooding. My previous experience many years ago was in dealing with planning law and policy, and how lots of houses were, government policy at one point was to build houses on floodplains and on water meadows and all sorts of things. So for me, that's a great consideration. Where I've said to my wife, whenever we move, I said we live up a hill.
Right. Good move.
So our insurance is partly to live up a hill, but not everyone can live up a hill. So so that's one. That's a second, if you like. And I think the third goes to international cooperation and learning. I find IS a very valuable institution in that respect. I think certainly from a UK point of view, international standards are very important, and we have a similar outlook with the FSB and IOSCO, for example. So sort of IOSCO being a kind of sister organisation, if you like, to IIS. So from my point of view, I think a lot of my regulatory life, if you like, has been focused on European and international cooperation and working together. And sometimes that's difficult, but what keeps me awake is, if this doesn't work, what do we do? Because then I think we would have failed, and I don't want to fail in my work for my organisation, but also in our work in IIS. I think we have a lot to share and a lot to learn.
That's very insightful, Nick. It is those most vulnerable individuals who suffer the most when the rules of the game are not set up properly, right? So
yeah.
Nick, I'd like to quickly return to where we started, which was, just for those of us who are new to the IAIS or don't have a lot of exposure to it, understanding some of the ways it operates. So I'd just like to go back to that quickly. Let's talk about the working group. So how many members are there, and how often do you meet, and how do you develop agendas?
Well, in terms of membership, it can vary, but I think I would say at a guess we have about 30 members from different regions of the world. So, and the same will go for other working groups. And there are also bodies which are task forces. So Operational Resilience has a task force, for example, or there are fora where things are discussed. So in terms of the agendas, those are in long term set by the strategic plan. So that's a 5-year document. So in 2019, the current one was agreed and issued. Then the next one will be from 2025 to 2029. So that sets out the broad parameters and sort of high-level goals, for example, that the organisation has. So then those are developed within the working groups. So you have a policy development committee that looks at that. And in terms of senior committees, policy development goes to the sort of things I've been talking about, but also I mentioned implementation, and there's an implementation and assessment committee And under that, you have quite a substantial set of work streams of assessing implementation and peer reviews and so on and so forth. So, and those are all done by the Secretariat supporting members who want to contribute. So in a way, the organization sustains itself with a clear leadership, and we have leadership of the EXCO is currently held by Vicky's support of the Prudential Regulation Authority in London, and a clear leadership and a clear agreement from the EXCO on where we want to go. So that's essentially how it works in very short order. So we take our cue from those working groups, and I think I was mentioning before about how we take forward the work. We think about the issues that we think are relevant and work on those and discuss them, and then go up the line to the Policy Development Committee and they feed back to us, and we also work with also consult publicly.
Excellent. Well, you've been a terrific panelist, Nick. I've certainly personally learned a tremendous amount and very appreciative. I just want to end the webinar by asking you for your final thoughts or words of wisdom, and then we'll conclude. So last word to you, Nick.
Well, thanks very much, Keith, for your invitation. I mean, I appreciate it very much. I would certainly say that international work has been a fascinating area. I've learned a heck of a lot from it. I think there's a lot of goodwill around to make things work, and I think we're not out to make life difficult for you or your colleagues. I think we just want to make things work as well as possible, and we're very interested to hear what people have to say, whether it's from industry or consumer groups or others. We try and take as broad an approach as possible to listening to what people have to say. So certainly that's the case with IS, and FCA has a long established procedure of consultation. So do talk to us, and don't assume that we're simply working in our own little world. We're all working in the domestic jurisdictions, and we try and bring our knowledge to the international arena to good effect, we hope.
Excellent. Well, that's much appreciated, Nick. Thank you so much again, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. And to all the participants and attendees in today's webinar, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you.